6 slaps. That is how many times my husband struck my face across the kitchen floor before he threw me out into a record-breaking blizzard with nothing but the clothes on my back. Julian thought I was a broken, penniless auditor who would freeze to death in the Denver snow. He had no idea that the venture capital firm funding his entire multi-million-dollar startup belonged to me, and that his execution day had just arrived. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. I want to thank you sincerely for your continuous support. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to operate, which means we will be forced to stop uploading new videos here in the near future and move our operations to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon to listen to even better, longer, and more detailed exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voices that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the Patreon link in the description or pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story of a woman named Heidi Rojas. The biting wind howled through the empty streets of Denver, Colorado, tearing at my clothes with a ferocity that felt deeply personal. It was the absolute worst blizzard this city had seen in a decade. The temperature had plummeted to -20 degrees, and the snow was already piling up past my knees. I had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift at Novacor Dynamics. To the rest of the world, I was just a tired, underpaid corporate auditor pushing spreadsheets for $52,000 a year. It was a perfectly boring disguise, a quiet life I had chosen to escape the suffocating weight of my real family name. All I wanted right now was the warmth of my home, a hot meal, and the comforting embrace of my husband, Julian. My fingers were completely numb as I fumbled with the keys, finally pushing the heavy oak door open the moment I stepped inside. The stark contrast of the heated house hit my freezing skin, making it tingle painfully, but the warmth of the air did not match the atmosphere of the house. There was no dinner waiting on the table. The lights in the living room were dimmed, and the fireplace cast dancing, erratic shadows across the walls. Then, I heard it, a soft, breathy moan followed by a low chuckle. I took off my snow-caked boots, my heart hammering against my ribs, and walked silently toward the living room. The sight that greeted me made my blood run colder than the Arctic storm raging outside. Julian, my husband of 3 years, the struggling tech startup CEO, whose dreams I had supported with every penny I earned, was tangled on our velvet sofa with another woman. I recognized her instantly, Chloe Vanguard. She was a notorious socialite and online influencer, constantly flaunting a life of extreme luxury on social media, though anyone with an ounce of financial literacy knew she was drowning in a sea of toxic debt. I stood there, a dripping, shivering mess in my cheap discount store winter coat, staring at the ruins of my marriage. Julian froze when he saw me, his eyes widening in brief, pathetic panic. But Chloe did not flinch. She did not scramble for her clothes or hide her face in shame. Instead, she let out a loud, mocking laugh, wrapping Julian's expensive cashmere blanket around her bare shoulders. "Oh, look, the little auditor is home," Chloe sneered, her eyes scanning my soaked, exhausted figure with utter disgust. "Julian, you did not tell me your wife looked like a wet stray dog." Julian recovered quickly, his panic melting into a mask of arrogant annoyance. He stood up, pulling on his trousers, completely unbothered by the devastation painted across my face. "What are you doing home so early, Heidi?" he demanded, as if I were the intruder in my own living room. "Early?" I whispered, my voice trembling not from the cold, but from a boiling, volcanic rage. "I worked a double shift to pay the mortgage on this house, the house you are defiling." Chloe laughed again, a high-pitched, grating sound. She leaned back against the sofa cushions, crossing her legs. "Oh, please, you do not have to play the tragic martyr anymore. Honey, Julian does not need your pathetic little paychecks. He just got the official nod from a massive angel investment fund, $2 million in seed capital. He is going to be a titan in the tech industry. And quite frankly, He does not need a mediocre, penny-pinching wife dragging down his new image. I stared at her, then shifted my gaze to the massive, glittering diamond earrings dangling from her ears. The anger inside me crystallized into something razor-sharp and deadly. "Is that so?" I said, my tone flattening into an eerie calm. "Tell me, Chloe, does a tech titan buy his mistress cubic zirconia? Because those earrings you are flaunting are cheap fakes. I saw the credit card statement yesterday. Julian bought them for $350 at a mall kiosk using a card that is maxed out. A card that I pay the minimum balance on every single month so his credit score does not plummet into the gutter. You are wearing my rent money, and it is not even real." Chloe's smug smile vanished instantly. Her face flushed a deep, ugly red as she reached up to touch the stones. She glared at Julian, demanding a silent explanation. Julian's face twisted in sheer humiliation. I had struck the one thing he cared about more than anything else in the world: his fragile masculine ego. His carefully constructed illusion of wealth had been shattered right in front of the woman he was trying to impress. "Shut your mouth," Julian roared. He lunged across the room with terrifying speed. Before I could even raise my hands to defend myself, his palm cracked against my cheek with the force of a whip. The impact threw me off balance, but he grabbed a handful of my wet hair to keep me upright, his face contorted in monstrous fury. He struck me again and again. The sound of flesh hitting flesh echoed sickeningly over the crackle of the fireplace. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 blistering, merciless slaps. The room spun wildly in a blur of colors and shadows. The metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth as my lips split open. He let go of my hair, and I collapsed onto the hard wooden floor, my vision swimming, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. "You disrespectful, worthless leech," Julian spat, standing over my bruised and bleeding body. "You think you can humiliate me? You think you are anything without me?" I tried to push myself up, my hands slipping on the damp floor, but he grabbed me by the collar of my cheap coat. He dragged me across the hallway, ignoring my weak struggles. The front door was violently yanked open. The ferocious wind tore into the house, bringing a blinding sheet of white snow with it. The weather advisory had explicitly warned that stepping outside tonight without proper gear was a death sentence. "We are getting a divorce," Julian snarled into my ear. "Do not ever come back." With one final, brutal shove, he threw me out into the raging blizzard. I tumbled down the icy front steps, landing hard in the knee-deep snow. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, and the deadbolt clicked into place, locking me out in the lethal, freezing darkness. The snow swallowed me whole. At -20 degrees Celsius, the human body does not just feel cold, it registers pure agony. The wind howled like a wounded animal, violently driving shards of ice into my face, freezing the blood that still trickled from my split lip. The numbness started in my fingers and toes, quickly creeping up my limbs, paralyzing my muscles. Every breath felt like inhaling crushed glass. I dragged my battered body toward the side of the porch, trying to find some small shield against the raging whiteout, but the storm was utterly unforgiving. My cheap winter coat offered no resistance. I was going to die here, buried under the snow, discarded like trash on the front lawn of the house I had paid for. But as the heavy, seductive blanket of hypothermia began to pull my consciousness into the dark, something else sparked deep within my chest. It was not the warmth of survival instinct. It was pride, a dark, ancient, and deeply dormant pride. With violently trembling hands, I reached into the hidden inner pocket of my coat and pulled out a heavy, outdated satellite phone. The screen was already coated in a thick layer of ice. I slammed it against the brick pillar of the porch, shattering the frozen crust. My fingers were stiff, pale, and completely unresponsive, but I forced my thumb to press the heavily encrypted sequence of numbers. It was a direct line I had sworn on my mother's grave I would never use. A lifeline to a world I had abandoned to live a normal, quiet life with a man who had just left me to freeze to death. The line did not even ring twice before it clicked open. "Speak," a deep, resonant voice commanded. It was Mateo Rojas, my older brother, the ruthless, untouchable tycoon who sat at the absolute apex of the American financial food chain, commanding Valerius Holdings, the most feared and powerful venture capital and private equity empire in the country. To Wall Street, he was a monster who swallowed corporations whole. To me, he was the blood I had tried to outrun. Mateo, I breathed, my voice barely a cracked whisper over the screaming wind. It is Heidi. A sharp, heavy silence fell over the line. Where are you? Why do you sound like that? The sudden shift in his tone sent a tremor of genuine terror through the receiver. I am outside the house. Julian threw me out into the blizzard. I gasped, the cold beginning to shut down my lungs. He hit me. Mateo. He hit me 6 times. I heard the sound of heavy glass violently shattering against a wall on the other end of the line. The temperature of Mateo's voice dropped colder than the Denver storm. Hold on to the phone. Do not close your eyes. I am tearing this city apart. The line went dead. I slumped against the frozen brick, my vision narrowing into a tiny, blurry tunnel. Time lost its meaning. The pain faded into a dangerous, floating numbness. I was ready to let go. But Mateo Rojas did not make promises he could not keep. Exactly 7 minutes later, the deafening roar of massive engines tore through the howling wind. Blinding high-beam headlights sliced through the dense curtain of white snow. Not one, but a fleet of 3 heavily armored, jet-black tactical sport utility vehicles jumped the curb with brutal force. They did not care about the driveway. The massive tires ripped right through Julian's perfectly manicured, frozen front lawn, crushing the expensive landscaping into the mud as they formed a protective barricade around the porch. Before the vehicles even came to a complete stop, the heavy doors flew open. A squad of heavily armed security contractors in tactical winter gear swarmed the yard. 2 massive men reached me, their movements swift and terrifyingly efficient. They wrapped me in a thick, heated thermal blanket and lifted me effortlessly from the snow, carrying me toward the center vehicle. The heavy armored door slammed shut, sealing off the roaring storm. The interior of the custom vehicle was a cavern of extreme luxury, heavily insulated and pumping out intense, glorious heat. I was gently laid across the soft, heated leather seats. A private doctor was already waiting, immediately pressing a warm intravenous line into my arm and checking my vitals. As the hot air filled my lungs and the agonizing sting of returning blood flow hit my veins, a profound transformation took place inside my mind. The naive, devoted, penny-pinching auditor who cried over mortgage payments and a cheating husband melted away, left out there to die in the snow, sitting up slowly in that luxurious cabin, feeling the familiar, intoxicating weight of absolute power settle back into my bones. I was reborn. I was Heidi Rojas again, the hidden co-heir, the silent mastermind, and the true, calculating brain behind the throne of Valerius Holdings. Sitting opposite me in the dim, amber light of the cabin was my private executive secretary, holding a secure tablet, his face pale and completely silent, awaiting my command. I reached up, wiping the smeared, dried blood from my mouth. My eyes, once warm and full of desperate love, were now hollow and completely devoid of mercy. Listen to me very carefully, I whispered, my voice dripping with lethal venom. I want you to buy up every single debt, every outstanding loan, and every financial obligation tied to Julian's company tonight. Call in every favor, pay whatever premium is required. The secretary nodded sharply, his fingers flying across the glowing screen. I leaned back against the plush leather, staring out the reinforced, tinted window at the faint, pathetic lights of Julian's house. Do not let him freeze to death. Let him burn to death in his own ambition. The morning sun pierced through the crisp, freezing Denver sky, casting a deceptive light over the city. Inside the house I had painstakingly paid for, Julian and Chloe woke up in a state of absolute euphoria. I knew exactly how Julian's mind worked. He must have glanced out the window, seen that the snow had buried the porch, and assumed I had managed to drag myself to a pathetic local shelter or a sympathetic friend's apartment. He did not spare a single second of guilt for the woman he had nearly killed. Why would he? In his inflated, narcissistic mind, today was the day he transcended his mortal life. Today, he was going to become a billionaire. As he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, carefully styling his hair and practicing his visionary chief executive officer smile, Chloe was already planning her ascension to the elite socialite throne. She snatched his shiny corporate credit card from the nightstand, planting a lipstick-stained kiss on his cheek before summoning an expensive black car service. Her destination was Cherry Creek, the most exclusive luxury shopping district in Colorado. Within 2 hours, she was storming through designer boutiques, swiping the company card for $10,000 handbags and outrageous diamond-studded heels. Her social media was a constant, pathetic stream of flashing camera lights and champagne toasts, boasting to her millions of fake followers about her upcoming life as a Titan's wife. She was spending money that did not exist, on the tab of a company that was about to be obliterated. They were celebrating a victory that was nothing more than a mirage, miles away from their suburban delusion. I sat in the grand, echoing living room of a $50 million penthouse perched at the very top of Denver's most exclusive high-rise. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a panoramic view of the snow-draped city below. I was no longer the exhausted auditor wrapped in a cheap polyester coat. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk dressing gown that flowed like water against the pristine marble floors. A renowned private physician stood quietly beside me, gently dabbing a highly specialized, soothing ointment onto the dark purple bruises blooming across my cheek and jawline. I waved the doctor away with a flick of my wrist and leaned forward over the massive mahogany dining table. Spread across the polished wood were the complete, unredacted financial reports of Julian's tech startup. It was a chaotic mess of fabricated projections and severely mismanaged funds. The greatest irony of Julian's pathetic existence was the angel investment fund he worshipped like a god. For months, he had been coming home, puffing his chest, bragging about how he had single-handedly courted the mysterious, ultra-exclusive Apex Horizon Ventures. He thought his sheer genius had secured the $2 million seed capital that would launch his empire. He did not know that Apex Horizon Ventures did not exist, at least, not in the way he thought. 2 years ago, when his very first business venture collapsed, and he wept like a child on our bedroom floor, I had quietly reached into the shadow network of Valerius Holdings. I created Apex Horizon as a perfectly constructed shell company, a financial ghost designed solely to inject anonymous capital into his fragile dreams. The intimidating board of directors he pitched his ideas to? They were my junior employees. The rigorous vetting process he bragged about surviving? It was a script I had written to make him feel important. I had built his entire world, brick by brick, from the shadows, and now I was going to tear it down. I picked up my encrypted tablet and initiated a secure video call. The face of Marcus, my top acquisitions director and the man playing the role of Apex Horizon's managing partner, appeared on the screen. "Good morning, Miss Rojas," Marcus said, bowing his head respectfully. "The target is currently sitting in our downtown conference room. He arrived 45 minutes early. He is practically shaking with excitement to sign the closing documents. He has been drinking our sparkling water and treating the receptionists like his personal servants all morning." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black espresso. "Give him the contract, Marcus, but make sure the updated clauses are firmly in place. They are woven into page 34 and page 52, exactly as you instructed," Marcus replied with a cruel, knowing smirk. We embedded a strict cross-collateralization clause, linking the corporate funds directly to his personal assets. We also added an absolute morality and fraud clause. If the fund detects any financial misrepresentation, hidden debts, or unethical conduct, we have the unilateral right to instantly freeze the disbursement, call in the entire debt, and seize 100% of his company, his intellectual property, and his primary residence. "He will not read it," I stated coldly, staring at the financial ruin laid out on my table. "He is too desperate, too arrogant, and far too greedy to let a lawyer review the fine print. He wants the money right this second, so he can impress his cheap mistress and prove he is a king." Let him sign it, and the exact moment his signature hits the paper, I want you to initiate the execution protocol." "Understood," Marcus said, terminating the connection. I set the tablet down and looked out over the freezing city. Julian thought he was climbing a golden ladder to the stars. He had no idea he was joyfully tying a reinforced steel noose around his own neck. Exactly 24 hours later, the invisible guillotine dropped. Julian was sitting in the private dining room of a 3-star Michelin restaurant downtown, celebrating his supposed victory. He had ordered a $5,000 bottle of vintage wine and was in the middle of giving a boastful toast to his 2 junior executives. He felt like the absolute king of the world, untouchable and supreme. Then, his phone vibrated sharply against the crisp white tablecloth. It was an urgent, high-priority alert from his primary banking institution. Julian casually swiped open the screen, expecting to see a massive deposit notification from Apex Horizon. Instead, his blood ran freezing cold. Bold, red letters flashed across the display. Every single corporate account, his operating funds, his payroll reserves, and his personal checking accounts were completely frozen. The reason listed was suspected severe financial fraud and immediate asset quarantine. Before he could even process the shock, a second notification chimed. It was an emergency email from his largest supply chain partner, the only manufacturing firm keeping his startup afloat. The email was not a congratulatory note. It was a brutal, formal termination of their master service agreement. They cited sudden market alerts regarding his frozen bank accounts and an immediate breach of fiduciary trust. To make matters infinitely worse, they invoked a strict penalty clause demanding compensation of 10 times the original contract value, effectively slapping him with a catastrophic debt of over $4 million payable within 7 days. Julian dropped his crystal wine glass. It shattered violently against the polished hardwood floor, but he could not hear the noise over the deafening roar of panic rushing through his ears. He began hyperventilating, aggressively loosening his expensive silk tie as he sprinted blindly out of the restaurant, leaving his confused executives behind. At that exact same moment, 3 miles away, Chloe was standing at the VIP checkout counter of a Chanel boutique. She had stacked 6 limited edition leather bags on the glass counter, chatting loudly on her phone about her upcoming private yacht vacation, so the entire store could hear her. She confidently handed the cashier Julian's heavy black corporate card. The cashier swiped it. A loud, sharp beep echoed across the quiet boutique. The register screen flashed red. "I am sorry, ma'am. This card has been declined," the cashier said politely. Chloe scoffed, rolling her heavily made-up eyes in exaggerated annoyance. "Try it again. The machine is obviously broken. Do you know who my fiancé is?" The cashier swiped it a second time, then a third. "It is giving a hard decline, ma'am. The authorization code indicates the account has been seized by the issuing bank." Hushed whispers erupted from the wealthy patrons standing nearby. Cell phones were suddenly raised, recording the notoriously flashy influencer as her fake empire crumbled in real time. Chloe's face turned a violent shade of purple. She snatched the useless plastic back, screaming vicious curses at the retail staff, and stormed out of the boutique empty-handed, utterly humiliated in front of the exact high society audience she craved to impress. Outside the restaurant, Julian was pacing wildly on the frozen sidewalk, dialing Marcus's number in a blind panic. The phone rang endlessly before transferring to a generic automated voicemail. Desperate, Julian opened his email bowl to contact the fund directly. Waiting at the very top of his inbox was a heavily encrypted legal document sent from the executive legal department of Apex Horizon Ventures. Julian's trembling fingers opened the file. It was a formal notice of default and immediate asset forfeiture. The legal jargon was incredibly dense, but the core message was a fatal strike. Because Julian had failed to disclose massive hidden debts and had falsified his revenue projections, he had triggered the absolute morality and fraud clauses he had blindly signed just 1 day prior. The fund was officially canceling the $2 million disbursement. Furthermore, to cover the severe penalties and legal risks, Apex Horizon was instantly seizing all cross-collateralized assets, That included 100% of his corporate shares, all of his intellectual property, and the deed to his primary residence. He had absolutely nothing. In the span of 60 seconds, his entire net worth had plummeted into the negative millions. Julian frantically called Chloe. When she finally answered, sobbing and screaming about her ruined public reputation at the mall, he barked at her to meet him at the house immediately. They both sped through the icy streets, running red lights in a desperate, chaotic dash back to the suburbs, but they were entirely too late. As Julian's car skidded to a halt in front of the driveway, the flashing red and blue lights of two local sheriff cruisers illuminated the snow. A heavy-duty moving truck was parked on the ruined lawn. 4 armed officers and a private execution team were already standing on the porch. The heavy oak door had a massive steel padlock drilled directly into the frame, and a bright yellow legal seizure notice was pasted prominently across the front window. Julian scrambled out of his vehicle, sprinting toward the officers, wildly waving his arms. "Stop! What are you doing? This is my house!" he screamed, his voice cracking hysterically into the freezing wind. A towering sheriff stepped forward, blocking his path with a firm hand resting on his utility belt. "Not anymore, sir. This property has been legally seized by the primary lien holder due to extreme corporate default. You are trespassing. Step back to the sidewalk immediately, or you will be arrested." Chloe stumbled out of her luxury rideshare, shivering violently in the biting wind, wearing only a thin designer jacket. She stared at the padlocked door, then at the stern officers, and finally at Julian, who had collapsed onto his knees in the snow, sobbing uncontrollably. The final illusion shattered completely. Chloe marched up to him, kicking a spray of dirty snow directly into his face. "You pathetic, broke liar!" she shrieked, her voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. "You told me you were a millionaire. You told me you owned all of this. I ruined my brand for a penniless fraud." Julian snapped. The fragile ego that had driven him to hit me just 48 hours prior exploded into raw, pathetic desperation. He lunged forward, grabbing the expensive lapels of her jacket, shaking her violently. "This is your fault. You distracted me. You drained my accounts buying fake followers and garbage clothes. I lost my wife because of you." "Your wife was right," Chloe screamed back, clawing at his face like a wild animal. "She paid for everything. You are absolutely nothing without her." The two traitors rolled around in the freezing mud and snow, tearing at each other's clothes, screaming vicious, unforgivable insults as the entire neighborhood watched in silent disgust. They had no money, no home, and no future. The invisible noose had finally pulled tight, and they were joyfully choking each other to death. The glittering winter town of Aspen, Colorado, sits 200 miles away from the dirty, frozen suburbs of Denver. But in terms of wealth and power, it exists in an entirely different universe. Tonight, the grand ballroom of the St. Regis was hosting the most exclusive royal charity gala of the year. This was a gathering of the absolute apex of American high society, a room where billionaires, seasoned politicians, and old-money aristocrats casually traded global markets over crystal glasses of vintage champagne. It was a fortress of extreme opulence, completely impenetrable to ordinary people. But desperate men will always find a way to claw through the dirt. Julian had exhausted every single favor he had left in the world. He had pawned his last remaining luxury watch for $3,000 just to rent a decent tuxedo and purchase a heavily scalped back-market entry ticket from a disgraced event promoter. He was driven by sheer, blinding desperation. His entire life had been erased in 24 hours, and his only remaining hope was to infiltrate this gala, find the mysterious billionaire backing Apex Horizon Ventures, and beg on his knees for a second chance. Through the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, Julian pushed his way into the blinding sea of wealth. He was sweating profusely, his cheap rented collar suffocating his neck. He looked utterly out of place. The elite patrons stepped aside as he shoved past them, casting him looks of profound disgust and whispering harsh insults about his frantic, unpolished demeanor. But Julian swallowed his pride, ignoring the humiliation. His frantic eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for the ultra-exclusive VIP lounge where the true titans of the evening were sequestered. He finally spotted the heavy, crimson velvet curtains guarded by a wall of massive security personnel in immaculate black suits. This was the inner sanctum. Julian practically threw himself at the entrance, pleading with the head of security, babbling incoherently about his tech startup and his absolute need to speak with the head of Apex Horizon. The guard simply stared at him with cold indifference, raising a hand to signal his immediate removal. But then, the guard paused. He pressed a finger to his hidden earpiece, listening to a direct command from inside the room. The guard stepped aside, grabbing the thick velvet rope and unhooking it. He gestured for Julian to enter. Julian's heart soared with pathetic, misguided hope. He thought his sheer persistence had won him an audience. He took a deep breath, adjusted his damp collar, and stepped through the heavy curtains. The inner sanctum was a masterclass in suffocating luxury. The walls were lined with rare art, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and exotic perfumes. Surrounding a massive, custom-built circular velvet sofa were the most powerful figures in the country. A prominent United States senator was laughing heartily, holding a glass of scotch. Two infamous hedge fund managers were standing with their heads bowed in deep respect. They were all orbiting around one single person seated at the center of the sofa, the absolute ruler of the room. Julian eagerly pushed his way to the front of the crowd, arranging his face into a mask of desperate humility. "Excuse me," Julian stammered, his voice cracking loudly in the sudden silence of the room. "I am Julian Sterling. I am the Chief Executive Officer of—" His voice died in his throat. The words evaporated into the heavy air. His eyes locked onto the woman sitting on the velvet sofa, and his entire brain short-circuited. It was me. I was no longer the exhausted, shivering auditor wearing clearance rack polyester. I was draped in a breathtaking, custom-designed midnight black silk gown that cascaded around me like liquid shadow. Resting against my collarbone was the legendary Azure Star, a flawless blue diamond necklace valued at roughly $85 million. My hair was impeccably styled, and my posture was that of a ruthless empress holding court. The politicians and billionaires who commanded the world were standing around me, obediently waiting for my permission to speak. Julian stood perfectly still, his face draining of all color until he looked like a frozen corpse. His eyes darted wildly from my face to the massive blue diamond, then to the silent, powerful men flanking my sides. His reality shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The invisible woman he had belittled, cheated on, and physically beaten was the absolute god of the world he had spent his entire pathetic life trying to enter. His knees buckled. The gravity of his massive, fatal mistake crushed his spine. Julian collapsed onto the plush carpet, landing hard on his knees right in front of the entire assembly of elites. "Heidi," he gasped, the name ripping from his throat in a ragged, terrified wheeze. The entire room stared at him with absolute, freezing contempt. Nobody moved to help him. I slowly crossed my legs, swirling the dark red wine in my crystal glass, looking down at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the Denver blizzard that nearly claimed my life. "Miss Rojas," the United States Senator corrected him sharply, his voice dripping with venom. "You will address the managing director of Valerius Holdings with the respect she commands, or you will be removed from this mountain by force." Julian did not even hear the threat. He began to crawl forward on his hands and knees, tears of sheer terror streaming down his face, ruining his borrowed tuxedo. He was completely broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had thrown me into the snow. "Heidi, please," Julian sobbed, reaching a trembling hand toward the hem of my gown, though he was too terrified to actually touch the silk. "I did not know. I swear to God I did not know. It was Chloe. She manipulated me. She poisoned my mind and made me think you were holding me back. She seduced me and spent all the money. You have to believe me. Heidi, we are husband and wife. You have to save me." I was practically hyperventilating, shifting all the blame onto the mistress he had sacrificed everything for, begging for the very marital bond he had violently destroyed. The utter cowardice of his display was nauseating to witness. I handed my crystal wine glass to the billionaire standing to my left, who took it with a gracious nod. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, bringing my face just inches away from his weeping, pathetic eyes. The room went dead silent. You could hear the faint crackle of the fireplace roaring in the corner. I raised my right hand, my diamond rings catching the dim, golden light of the chandelier. I held his terrified gaze and slowly, deliberately, began to fold my fingers down, counting out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I held up my hand, showing him the number. 6 slaps, Julian, I whispered, my voice echoing like a death sentence in the quiet room. You hit me 6 times, and for every single slap, I took a piece of your life, your company, your house, your honor, your freedom, your future, and your pathetic, gold-digging mistress. Julian let out a gut-wrenching wail, bowing his head until his forehead hit the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into the carpet. He knew it was over. There was no mercy left in my heart, only the absolute magnificent satisfaction of total destruction. Before Julian could even finish his pathetic sobbing, the heavy oak doors of the VIP lounge were violently thrown open. The sudden noise shattered the quiet murmur of the room. A squad of men and women wearing stark tactical jackets marched into the velvet-lined sanctuary. Emblazoned across their backs in bold yellow lettering were the initials of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The gathered billionaires and politicians seamlessly parted like the Red Sea, casually stepping back with absolute indifference to let the agents pass. The lead federal agent stood directly over Julian's trembling, kneeling form. Over the last 48 hours, I had not just dismantled his current venture, I had handed the federal authorities a flawless, undeniable dossier exposing his entire history. I gave them ironclad proof of his massive financial crimes, detailing exactly how he had aggressively doctored corporate books and deliberately defrauded his early-stage investors for the past 3 years. But the authorities did not come alone. 2 younger agents stepped through the velvet curtains, dragging a hysterical, disheveled woman securely clamped in heavy steel handcuffs. It was Chloe. Her meticulously curated image was completely annihilated. Her expensive hair extensions were tangled, and dark streaks of ruined mascara stained her cheeks. The moment she realized Julian was utterly broke, she had sprinted straight to the federal authorities, desperately trying to trade her silence for absolute immunity as a star witness against him. But she lacked the basic intelligence to understand that signing her name on his fake expense reports to fund her shopping addictions made her a direct, legally bound accessory to corporate money laundering. When Julian looked up and saw his glamorous mistress in chains, the last shred of his sanity snapped. He leaped off the carpet, letting out a feral scream, and lunged wildly at her throat. He cursed her for destroying his marriage and his empire. Chloe shrieked, violently kicking her bare feet at his shins, spitting venomous insults right back at his face. They tore into each other like rabid street dogs right there on the luxurious carpet. It was a spectacular, pathetic comedy, playing out live for the most powerful people in America, who simply watched them with quiet, aristocratic disgust. The agents swiftly tackled them both to the floor, aggressively dragging the screaming, thrashing traitors out of the ballroom and into the freezing night. 6 months later, the justice system delivered its final, crushing blow. The financial news networks enthusiastically broadcast the conclusion of the highly publicized trial. Julian was officially sentenced to serve 15 arduous years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for grand-scale wire fraud and embezzlement. Chloe faced devastating financial restitution and severe criminal penalties. Stripped of her stolen wealth, her fake followers, and her stolen youth, she faded instantly into absolute, miserable obscurity. As the news anchor announced the final verdict, I stood in my sprawling, glass-enclosed executive office on the highest floor of the Valerius Holdings Tower. The city below was quietly drowning in another heavy winter snowfall, but up here, the air was warm and silent. I took a slow, deliberate sip of a rare vintage red wine, the crystal glass cool against my hand. My private phone vibrated on the marble desk. A single, encrypted text message flashed on the screen from my brother, Matteo. He was asking if I wanted him to secretly purchase the private prison facility currently housing Julian, just so we could ensure his 15-year sentence felt like a century of absolute hell. A soft, cold smile touched my lips. I reached out and pressed the power button, plunging the screen into total darkness. "There is no need," I whispered to the empty, magnificent room. "For a dead man, being completely forgotten is the most brutal punishment of all." I turned my back to the massive window, leaving the freezing snow and the ashes of my past behind me. Walking toward my heavy obsidian desk, I officially stepped into the era of my own absolute rule. The tragic, penniless wife was dead. The queen had finally taken her throne. Thank you so much to all the wonderful listeners of Maya Revenge Stories for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story empowering and thrilling, I have an important request. As I mentioned earlier, this channel has lost all its funding and will no longer upload new videos here in the near future. We are transitioning entirely to Patreon to survive. Please help keep this community alive by joining our Patreon, where you will get exclusive access to our absolute best, longest, and most detailed true revenge stories that are simply too intense to make public on this platform. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Thank you for your incredible support, and I cannot wait to share the next glorious story with you there.